My announced topic is mixed signals, but I also might have called it missed signals. So many misperceptions have grown up around Bernie Madoff's epic fraud and its relationship to the financial meltdown of 2008 that I think we're missing what we really need to learn from the Madoff scandal. My aim today is to try to pull out some of the weeds so we can see the issues, especially the regulatory issues, a little more clearly. First, let me introduce you to the Bernie Madoff that you will meet in the pages of The Wizard of Lies. He spent his childhood in the almost seamless prosperity of small-town Long Island. Days remembered as almost idyllic by his classmates, but his own memories of those years were much darker because of his father's serial business failures. Those failures bred a deep insecurity in the Madoff family, anxieties that may have given rise to Madoff's nearly pathological inability to admit failure in his own life. When faced with a choice between admitting failure by revealing that he had lost money for his clients or cheating his clients so that he could still look like a genius, well, he didn't hesitate. He cheated. Indeed, on my first of 2 interviews with Madoff in prison, he refused to even admit that his epic Ponzi scheme had been a failure. He insisted that he could have kept it going despite the panic in the markets in the fall of 2008 that we are all here to observe. There were still people eager to invest with him, he said. So no, it wasn't a failure. His Ponzi scheme didn't fail. He simply got tired of the constant tap dance of bringing in more money and just decided to quit. And he never would have admitted that ultimate failure, that ultimate confession that he had failed a suicide attempt shortly after his arrest. If his wife Ruth hadn't innocently revealed it in interviews last month. His email to me confirming that attempt ended, "Please understand how hard this is for me to admit." Believe me, I understand. To the relief, no doubt, of the law profession, Madoff dropped out of law school after 1 year. And in 1960, he hung out his shingle as an over-the-counter dealer in years when almost anyone with a pulse could make a decent living trading high-margin, over-the-counter stocks. When that got harder, he began to specialize in a strategy known as riskless arbitrage, involving convertible bonds, stocks, rights, and warrants. There's no test later. I won't detail these for you, but I was able to track down some longtime traders on Wall Street who remembered actually dealing with Madoff's firm in legitimate trades, significant trades, as a market maker in these arcane arbitrage securities. So it is at least theoretically possible that he was earning legitimate profits for his clients into the early 1980s. We don't know exactly when Madoff stepped over the line. Some people think he was dishonest from day one. He himself insists that his Ponzi scheme didn't start until 1992. My own research suggests that it's more likely, although I can't say definitively, it is more likely that it started sometime in the mid-1980s, certainly by the end of 1987. But regardless of when this Ponzi scheme started, Madoff put his own distinctive stamp on what is, after all, a very old crime. Before it was called a Ponzi scheme, after Charles Ponzi, who carried a massive one out in Boston in 1920, it was called a Peter to Paul scheme, as in robbing Peter to pay Paul, and it had been around for centuries. But the camouflage that Madoff used to disguise his particular Ponzi scheme for so long was absolutely remarkable. He had a computer program that would generate what looked like a live account screen for Wall Street's Central Clearinghouse. Now, the screen was fake, completely bogus, but it created the illusion that all of the stocks and bonds that he was supposed to have were there, safe and sound. He used this screen on at least one occasion that we know about from the record to reassure one of his largest hedge fund investors that everything was on the up and up. He kept old letterhead stationery and an old Selectric typewriter, remember those, a little bouncing ball, so that he could create realistic-looking backdated documents to stick into the files to satisfy regulators or investors' questions. He told foreign auditors that he was trading with U.S. banks, and he told U.S. regulators he was trading with foreign banks, knowing that the extra trouble involved in making those cross-border checks would likely deter any further investigation, as unfortunately it did. Fueling it all, of course, was a personality sharply different from any Ponzi schemer I have met in life or in history, and one of the advantages of my job is I do get to meet rather more of them, perhaps, than you do, fortunately. The classic Ponzi personality is a charismatic, gregarious bon vivant, the life of the party, the guy over in the corner everyone wants to bring drinks for. Madoff was a quiet-spoken, reserved guy who hated parties and whose favorite night out was dinner with his wife. The typical Ponzi schemer is relentlessly determined to persuade you that he is the smartest person in the room. Madoff made you feel like you were the smartest person in the room. I saw this talent in action, and I would not have understood how powerful it was if I hadn't. When I interviewed him in prison the first time, I was short on time. I'd asked for 4 hours. The warden had granted me 2. I was watching the clock. And Madoff started to digress in one of his answers to explain an arcane strategy for me called shorting against the box. Again, there's no quiz later. Well, I knew what shorting against the box was, and time was short. I just wanted him to get along with the story he was telling, and I said, I know what that is. Like, move along. Well, he gave this little smile, and he looked over at his lawyer, and he said, it's such a pleasure to deal with someone so knowledgeable about the markets. Clearly, I was one of the most intelligent, experienced, trustworthy reporters he'd ever met. Now, the impact of his admiration was tempered a little by the fact that I already knew he was a confessed liar and swindler. But I could imagine how potent that magic touch must have been for people who still thought he was a genius, who still thought he was a wizard. Instead of trying to impress you, Madoff seemed impressed by you. And what could be more seductive than that? And instead of being eager for your business, as the classic Ponzi schemer was, he seemed utterly indifferent to whether or not you trusted him with your money. He didn't care. After all, he was only managing money as a favor for a few long-term clients, you understand, a few friends. He already had more money to manage than he wanted to bother with, so go ahead. Take your money somewhere else. He didn't care. But of course you wouldn't. Not after that reassuring indifference. It was a remarkable form of emotional jujitsu. People who probably would have been instantly suspicious of the classic Ponzi personality were blindsided by Madoff's quiet magnetism and his laid-back confidence. And let's not fool ourselves. Most likely we would have fallen for him too. Because as different as Madoff was from the classic Ponzi schemer, he shared one essential characteristic with all of them. He could win your trust. That is the sine qua non for the Ponzi schemer. A shifty-eyed drifter in a cheap suit may commit any number of crimes, ladies and gentlemen, but a Ponzi scheme will never, ever be one of them. Madoff was as much an innovator in the realm of crime as he was in the legitimate role in the over-the-counter market that he played, a role that helped lead to the creation of the modern NASDAQ market. Unlike most Ponzi schemers, he wrapped his fraud inside a successful, legitimate business, a rarity. That legitimate business became one of Wall Street's largest and most technologically advanced wholesale stock trading houses, and he kept it squeaky clean. Even while the Ponzi scheme was barreling along, the Madoff brokerage firm was conspicuously absent from the NASDAQ price-fixing scandal of the mid-1990s. And Madoff's regulators rarely found more than a technical misstep or two by his trading desk. They didn't know for years that he had a secret money managing business operating out of another floor. And when they did know, he assured them that it was way too small to even fall under their jurisdiction. So it was the strength of this legitimate business that ultimately gave rise to the whispers that Madoff was achieving his consistent returns by front-running, a form of insider trading. Again, no quiz later. Madoff almost seemed to encourage people to suspect that he was front-running. Why would he do that? Well, the outcome of any front-running investigation would always be the same. He would be exonerated because, in fact, he was completely innocent of front-running. At least, that was one crime he was not committing. Of course, Madoff's criminal ingenuity and quietly magnetic charm had devastating human consequences. Apart from the evaporation of nearly $65 billion that his investors believed they had the night before his arrest, and almost $18 billion in cash that they had given him to invest and never gotten back, at least 2 investors committed suicide soon after learning about their Madoff losses. Suicide also claimed Madoff's own son, Mark, crushed by the relentless suspicion that fell on Madoff's wife and children. Suspicion that still surrounds his family, although not a single incriminating post-it note has emerged from the 11 million pages of documentation that have been reviewed by the bankruptcy trustee and the confessed conspirators who are assisting the criminal investigations. If we add in all the family homes that had to be sold, the college years that were interrupted, the pension plans that were bankrupted, the charities that were shuttered, the grant recipients suddenly shortchanged, and the wreckage from the Madoff scandal stretched far and wide, as did the devastation of the market crisis in the fall of 2008. But the only link between Madoff's collapse and that financial meltdown was the meltdown was what finally capsized Madoff's long-running fraud. True, for the media and for much of the nation, Madoff quickly became the human face of that meltdown, the face of trust betrayed. But in fact, the financial bubble that led up to the meltdown had almost nothing to do with Madoff's fraud. Indeed, if we take Madoff at his word, not always a good idea, but if we take Madoff at his word that the fraud began in 1992, it had already survived a global currency crisis in 1998, the collapse of the dot-com bubble in 1999, the recession and terrorist attacks in 2001, the market upheaval after the Enron scandal in 2002, and an internal cash flow crisis that almost brought it down in the fall of 2005, a crisis that is first detailed in my book. If I'm right, and the fraud actually started 5 to 7 years earlier than Madoff admits, it also survived a second recession, the 1987 market crash, and the mini crash of 2 years later. Remember, a Ponzi scheme is simply a liar with a bank account. That's all it is. Ponzi schemes thrive in good times and bad. And in fact, we are right now harvesting the first vintage of what I call post-Madoff Ponzi schemes. These are Ponzi schemes that started after Madoff's arrest and have flourished through the heart of the Great Recession. So clearly, bubbles are not necessary to Ponzi schemes. Those who are determined to see Madoff as just one more giant tree in the vast forest of the bubble decade, a population which unfortunately included a large number of journalists, are simply wrong on the facts. The bubble didn't create Madoff, and of course Madoff didn't create the bubble. But he certainly was its beneficiary in many aspects. Some of the most tragic stories from the Madoff scandal are about victims who took advantage of the skyrocketing home prices and the cheap mortgages to borrow against their homes and invest with Madoff. When his Ponzi scheme collapsed, they lost not only all their savings, but their homes as well. And when the derivatives craze prompted some banks to create notes that were tied to the performance of some of Madoff's big feeder funds, they had to hedge their exposure to those notes by investing in the feeder funds directly, and so those derivative notes simply put more cash into Madoff's hands. So yes, he used the bubble, but he certainly didn't cause it, nor did he cause it to pop so disastrously. If there is any connection between Madoff and the meltdown, it is this: both were the product of fearful investors who put too much trust in the wrong places. Misplaced trust was what allowed Madoff to transcend the classic boundaries of the Ponzi scheme and create a truly global fraud, the first truly global Ponzi scheme. The typical Ponzi scheme is limited to the circle of trust the Ponzi schemer himself can create. This is why they classically are affinity frauds, where people can hide under a label of a fellow church member, a fellow Rotarian, a fellow service member, in order to expand their circle of trust. But Madoff went one further. Madoff was able to hijack the trust inspired by other people and other institutions. The trust that people placed in aristocratic private bankers in France and Switzerland, in pedigreed British banks in Dubai, in long-established banks in Tokyo, in trusted money managers in Brazil. By exploiting investors' trust in the last link of whatever chain led back to his bank account, Madoff was able to extend the tentacles of his Ponzi scheme literally around the world. But unlike the classic Ponzi scheme, and this is important, Madoff did not exploit his investors' greed. He exploited their fear. And it was a brilliant innovation, one that was perfectly timed to benefit from the growing anxiety that a generation trying to save for retirement, a generation terrified of the increasingly complex marketplace, was confronted with. This had practical benefits for Madoff because it spared him the classic pitfall that dooms most Ponzi schemes to a short but brilliant life. The typical greed-driven Ponzi scheme must produce returns high enough to attract greedy people. Sky-high, get-rich-quick promises, profits that will quickly burn through all the fresh cash the Ponzi schemer is frantically raking in. But a Ponzi scheme fueled by fear doesn't even need to match the market. In fact, one Madoff investor analyzed Madoff's returns and found that most of his investors would have made more money if they had invested in the Fidelity Magellan Fund than with Madoff. A more recent analysis done for me by a market consultant identified more than a handful of brand name mutual fund and hedge fund managers, many of them names you would recognize, who outperformed Madoff for years on end. His returns were always plausible, a little too consistent, but often not even as good as you could have gotten in a public mutual fund. Too consistent, but then that's what he promised, consistency. One wise analyst who has studied recent Ponzi schemes, Pat Huddleston, put it this way: if it sounds too good to be true, you're dealing with an amateur. And Madoff was no amateur. He knew better than to dangle ludicrous promises under the noses of gullible but greedy investors. No. Madoff was offering safety and security and simplicity to frightened but overly trusting investors. Investors trying to navigate a crazy, complicated marketplace that had become wildly volatile and increasingly incomprehensible. So fear was the first common thread between Madoff and the meltdown. The market crisis of 2008 was the climax of an era when fear became the constant background music for most American investors. One dominant theme, of course, was the fear of retiring with nothing. Incomes were stagnant, but expectations weren't. One breadwinner became two breadwinners, who soon became two breadwinners with a lot of debt. And not long after that, two breadwinners with a lot of debt and no pension plan they could fall back on. And every 3 months or so, some financial magazine would remind these frantic Americans that they were not saving anywhere near enough for retirement, that they were going to wind up eating Alpo if they didn't scrape together some extra cash and invest it wisely in a 401k. Avoiding the stock market was simply not an option unless you were willing to settle for dog food dinners. But if average Americans were afraid of staying out of the market, they became increasingly frightened of getting into it. When I was newly married 42 years ago, our investment choices were simple. Many of you will remember those days. Bank CDs, well-regulated mutual funds, municipal bonds, maybe a home if we could qualify for a mortgage, and thanks to the GI Bill, we could. A few years later, we could add a few shares of our employer's stock, a money market fund. But the financial engineers of Wall Street gradually changed that simple landscape into an intimidating labyrinth, with 5 classes of stock for a basic mutual fund, undiversified sector funds that speculated on a tiny slice of the economy, annuities that varied beyond comprehension, REITs that barely traded at all, and exotic derivatives named after insects for some reason. People at picnics talked about the profits their neighbors were making day trading on the internet, remember? Market volatility began to scare even the market professionals, much less you and me. We would read stories about portfolio insurance. And then after those had blown up, we would read stories about credit default swaps. Well, who could imagine? And hey, we weren't alone in being baffled. Red-faced bankers and corporate CEOs regularly announced that they had incurred some gigantic loss because they hadn't been able to understand what that clever trader downstairs was doing, except that it was extremely profitable while it lasted. This was the fear that had people angling for an introduction to Bernie Madoff. But we all felt it. We all feel it. We are all frightened of what the American market has become. A market filled with risks we can't understand and pitfalls we're not sure how to avoid. Besides fear, the other link between Madoff and the meltdown was trust, misplaced trust, manifested in 2 particularly devastating ways. People who were worried that they were saving too little for retirement put their trust in home ownership. You've seen the statistics. By 2003, home equity accounted for more than 40% of all household wealth and more than 60% of the household wealth of homeowners. Buying a home seemed simple and safe. I managed to do it when I was 23 with my husband. Increasingly, it was the primary retirement plan for middle American households. Homeowners were getting richer faster than people who didn't own homes. So if you couldn't save for retirement, at least you could watch the value of your home go up every year and calculate how well you could live when you sold it, retired, and downscaled. Americans no longer trusted their own ability to navigate Wall Street, but they knew how to buy a house, and they trusted the wisdom of homeownership as a route to a safe retirement. So the seeds of the housing bubble were planted. At the same time, Americans who were baffled by the market's increasing complexity also placed their trust in the wizards and high priests of finance. Madoff was one of them, of course, but there were countless others. The number crunchers at the rating agencies, the allegedly brilliant young people running blue-chip hedge funds, the confident financial planners, a few cocksure Wall Street economists, no one in this room, and the magisterial bank regulators. But what else could the average American do but find someone to trust? Investing had become as complicated as brain surgery. They had full-time jobs and were trying to manage a do-it-yourself pension plan in their spare time. So they had to rely on the experts they met in the media, people who actually seemed to understand what was going on. People like Bernie Madoff. Yes, but also a lot of other honest and well-intentioned people who were not running Ponzi schemes, thank God, but who were giving sometimes ill-informed or unsuitable investment advice to people who trusted them completely. So trust and fear were the twin forces that drew people to Bernie Madoff and set the stage for the profound sense of betrayal that came in the wake of the meltdown of 2008. When that betrayal came, Madoff became its human face. There was a wonderful cartoon in the New Yorker last summer, and perhaps you saw it, and it suggests to me the reality of what's happened next. A small family is surrounded by dense jungle, and the father in his pith helmet is holding a map, and he says, okay, I admit it, we're lost. But the important thing to remain focused on is whose fault it is. The media, of course, has a tendency to remain focused on whose fault it is. We call it accountability, and it's usually a pretty healthy response to a scandal. And the verdict came in quickly in the aftermath of the Madoff scandal and the meltdown. The culprits, clearly, were greed and risk. Greed got top billing in the Madoff case. The increasingly sensationalized tabloid coverage fed the public's perception that Madoff's ruined investors, like all classic Ponzi scheme investors, were victims of their own greed. Smug observers would smirk and say, well, you can't cheat an honest man, which is surely the most nonsensical piece of observation that's ever been made about the world of finance. Honest people get cheated every day in ways too nefarious and numerous to count. Thousands of honest people were cheated by Bernie Madoff. The media conclusion about where to put the blame for the meltdown was even more uncompromising. Greedy Wall Street bankers, in pursuit of profits, had taken ridiculous risks and driven the financial system to the edge of a cliff, abetted by regulators hoping for Wall Street jobs and politicians hoping for Wall Street donations. Now, of course, there are elements of truth in both of those assessments. There were Madoff investors who were greedy, and there were some who were greedy at the very least for the cachet of being a Madoff investor, being part of that exclusive club. Heaven knows there were many people on Wall Street who were incredibly reckless and selfish in their pursuit of profit, impatient with the constraints of even a poorly funded and badly managed regulatory regime, and largely indifferent to the consequences of what they did for the rest of us. But blaming greed and risk and nothing else for the Madoff crisis and the meltdown doesn't get us very far unless we also consider the role of trust and fear and look at what those twin forces reveal about our regulatory architecture. It is impossible for me to look at the Madoff scandal, especially, and not see it as evidence that the way we've been regulating our stock market since the New Deal simply may not work anymore. That regulatory approach, based on the concept of full disclosure, failed abysmally to protect average investors from Bernie Madoff. Indeed, it didn't even protect the market's most sophisticated investors from Madoff or from the most toxic mortgage-backed monsters that were set loose on Wall Street. Now, it saddens me to admit the doubts I have about the full disclosure regime. For decades, I have taught young business journalists about the wonders of that regime, how it was based on the assumption that sunlight is the best disinfectant, how it generates this vast abundance of public documents that could produce such wonderful stories for those of us who read them all. I would explain that the cumbersome alternative to this brilliant approach was a discredited regime based on merit review, where state bureaucrats would decide whether a specific investment passed muster and could be sold inside their borders. I would probably tell that funny story about how Massachusetts securities regulators once refused to approve an IPO for a preposterous little company that planned to sell computers to individual consumers, when everybody knew consumers were only purchased by large corporations and giant universities. That IPO, of course, was for a little company called Apple. So I believed in the wisdom of the full disclosure regime for my entire career as a business journalist, until I began to study the Madoff scandal. As the inevitable Wall Street joke machine quickly informed us, the Madoff scandal proved once and for all that there's really no such thing as a sophisticated investor. Everyone, from hedge fund due diligence lawyers to retired school teachers, simply everyone invested in Madoff primarily as a leap of faith. Blind faith in someone they had decided to trust for reasons that had nothing to do with the full disclosure and the fine print that our regulators think will keep us safe if only we'd read every word of it, which of course we will never do because it's impossible to understand. As an investor, I don't read the fine print. And admit it, at least to yourself, you don't either. And that's the fatal flaw in the full disclosure regime. It was designed for a time when an individual investor meant a prudent gentleman in Boston who learned to manage money at his trust officer's knee. And when investment advisor or stockbroker meant his roommate at Harvard or Yale, who felt a little awkward about even charging him a commission. In researching earlier books of business history, I've spent a lot of time with the fine print of those long ago decades. A high school sophomore, well, a sophomore with a trust fund or a rich dad, could have understood all of it. But we're not in that world anymore. Today's investors don't have time to undertake the kind of financial education it takes to understand every word of that fine print. They're looking for simplicity and security and a good, steady return. But most of all, they're looking for someone they can trust who will take over that search for them while they get back to the business of life. Of course, it's easier to take things on faith, especially complicated things we imperfectly understand. But beyond that, I think we are hardwired to trust one another. There are some scientific cognitive studies that bear that out, and that trait inevitably leaves us vulnerable to anyone willing to exploit our trust to steal from us. But what do we do? I mean, it's transparently true how to eliminate Ponzi schemes. I know how to eliminate Ponzi schemes. I'll give you my secret recipe right now. Clinical paranoia. Yep. A total lack of trust in anything or anybody. Ponzi schemes are impossible in a world devoid of trust. But nobody wants to live in a world like that. And indeed, modern commerce is impossible in a world like that. So we've got to figure out a way to navigate, to regulate in the world that we've got, which is a world that has a market that runs on trust or doesn't run at all. And the Madoff scandal suggests very strongly that the full disclosure regime simply may not work in a market driven primarily by blind faith. The problem isn't just that nobody reads the complicated fine print, and I think we can all agree that nobody reads the complicated fine print. Even if Madoff investors had gotten some fine print and read every word of it, they probably wouldn't have seen the red flags simply because they had already made the only decision that mattered. They had already decided to trust a wizard named Bernie Madoff. We are all inclined to waive the rules for the wizards we trust. And once we trust them, we simply will not see the red flags warning us we're in danger. Recall that famous Harvard cognitive function test called the invisible gorilla. I'm sure all of you have seen it or heard about it. I'm going to spoil it for you now. Test takers are focused on counting the number of passes in a short video clip of a basketball game. Team in black, team in white, count the passes. At the end, they are asked, did you notice anything odd during the game? No, I didn't notice anything, but I counted more passes than the other guy. So you didn't notice the gorilla. More than half of the test takers will drop their jaw at this point and ask, gorilla? What gorilla? There was no gorilla. I'm absolutely certain if there had been a gorilla in that video clip, I would have seen it. But there was a gorilla. A student in a full-body gorilla suit who walked onto the court, beat her chest for dramatic effect, and walked off, all in about 6 or 7 seconds. The test takers who never saw the gorilla simply could not believe they had missed it. After all, they saw it clear as day after they knew what to look for. And we all saw the red flags around Madoff, clear as day, after we knew what to look for. Once we were no longer blinded by trust. Now, some people put their trust in Madoff. Some put their trust in market wizards selling mortgage-backed securities. Some put their trust in Vanguard or TIAA-CREF or Neuberger Berman. But the method is the same even when the outcome is vastly different. People invest based on trust, not on a careful scrutiny of the fine print. People who trusted Madoff, whether they were school teachers in New Mexico or due diligence lawyers in Switzerland, didn't read the fine print. Some of them didn't even ask for any. And if they had asked for some, it is not clear at all that they would have seen the red flags hidden there. So the way to fix what went wrong clearly is not to generate more and more fine print. What is the answer? I suggest some slightly tongue-in-cheek approaches in The Wizard of Lies. I wonder, for example, if we should require investors to pass a test and get a license before they can enter the market, and bar any broker from dealing with an unlicensed investor, as opposed to barring investors from dealing with unlicensed brokers. After all, we require driver's ed classes and a behind-the-wheel test before you can get a license to drive. Why not require at least that much training before you drive your retirement savings off a cliff? More practically, maybe we should get serious as a nation about fostering financial literacy and require every high school senior to master the basics of personal finance before they can get a diploma. Maybe that would be better. Or we could take a fresh look at some enlightened form of merit review. I can hear the lawyers cringing at this point, but this new merit review regime might borrow from the medical world and create something like a formulary, a list of vetted and approved investments that are safe for conservative investors and that are watched like a hawk by regulators. Anything not on the list could still be sold. It's a free country, of course, but strictly on a caveat emptor basis. If you buy some exotic nonsense that wasn't on that list, don't come crying to regulators when it turns out to be a fraud. Or we could make the penalties for betraying investor trust so draconian that Wall Street would actually police itself. If a rogue broker could cost an entire branch office its license to do business, it's at least possible that someone in that office would blow the whistle on that rogue. In this enlightened world, of course, the compliance lawyers who catch the bad apples early would make as much as the stars on the derivatives desk and the private banking unit. Now you're not so upset with this approach, are you? Perhaps it would be safe to let investors act totally on blind faith if Wall Street itself had a powerful incentive to keep its eyes wide open. Now, these are just a few modest proposals in the Jonathan Swift tradition. I don't know if they would work, but I do know that doing what we're doing now, much less doing more of what we're doing now, almost certainly is not going to work. We all have the capacity to miss what seems to be right under our noses. If we're not expecting it, if we're focused intently on something else, if we've let our trust in someone blur our vision. But knowing that we have these weaknesses, that is the charm that could protect us. If only we would use that awareness to build a regulatory scheme that acknowledges those weaknesses and adapts to them. Instead, we have a regulatory scheme that simply ignores our weaknesses and pretends that all investors are just like that prudent man in Boston. In short, we have a regulatory regime that, like Madoff's fraud, is built largely on self-deception. It is designed for a world, for a kind of investor that simply doesn't exist anymore. And that's the primary thing we must learn, both from the Wizard of Lies and the financial meltdown. In a world full of lies, the most dangerous ones are those we tell ourselves. Thank you.